Hello, this is Terrorism, um, and we're looking at Chapter 7, Religious Terrorism. So, um, some of the things that we want to think about when we're thinking about terrorism in relation to religion. The chapter starts by putting this into a sort of historical perspective in relation to religious violence. They talk about how religious terrorism can be communal, it can be genocidal, nihilistic, or it can be revolutionary in nature. Um, and it can run the gamut. It can be committed by either lone wolves, it can be committed by cells, um, large dissident movements, or all the way up to governments. Um, in your book, we'll cover all of these. There's an ongoing debate on whether individuals who commit those acts should be considered terrorists or freedom fighters. So it depends, I guess, on which perspective you take, um, and I guess what the motivation of the people are, um, and etc. So it's generally taken on, I guess, a case by case basis. So, again, going back to ancient times, um, uh, we can look back to even the Bible, right? Um, Through Judeo Christian antiquity, the Bible references in the book of Joshua the conquest of Canaan, which is modern day Palestine. Um, and they talk about the complete annihilation of the enemies of the Hebrews, right? And they say that this was totally okay because it was all in pursuit of God's will, right? And so it was perfectly acceptable to lay waste and indiscriminately kill all of these people because it was God's will, okay, according to the Bible. Though, of course, if we were to think about that today, that would in a way sort of be like a form of perhaps either state-sponsored terrorism, maybe, or what have you, but it would definitely be some form of terror, right? Because it's a group of people that for political motives are going in and slaughtering people. They feel like, and it's religiously based, and they feel that they're doing it because their God wills them to do it, and that sanctions those actions, right? So another historical perspective, we can go and look at the Christian Crusades. Think about the invasion of the Islamic East. The First Crusade was in 1095 by the Roman Catholic Church. Of course, remember at that time, the only Christian church that existed was the Catholic Church. It conducted all of its activities in the name of the cross, right? It would go around carrying the cross. And the purpose was to recapture the Holy Lands from the Muslims because, again, the caliphate, Muhammad's caliphate had spread and taken over control of the Holy Land where Jerusalem was, etc. Pope Urban II promised martyrdom to anybody who fought on behalf of the church. And so basically, if you died in battle, you were automatically given entrance into heaven. And even if you didn't die in that battle, just fighting, and you survived and you died of old age, just doing and engaging in this activity guarantees you a spot in heaven, regardless of what happened before or after. This was very promising and seemed like a great deal to a lot of people. Um, there were a total of 4 crusades. This was the first one, and there would be 3 more that came afterwards. They were very bloody and violent. They even killed Christians, some those who were very the Greek Orthodox, of the Greek Orthodox variety. Okay, the Byzantines that would come later. So, and again, this is all justified in the name of the church, right? So, the historical perspective, again, we're focusing on that. The assassins, okay? This is where the term assassin came from. This was founded by Hassan ibn al-Sabah in 11th century Persia. A key component was the righteousness of their cause and methodology. This tends to be, again, a key component really of most of these types of groups, right? And the organization was eliminated in 1256. But again, they went around and again killed in the name of God, okay, and felt that what they were doing was that they were doing God's will. Okay, you can look more into that in your book. In India, they had their own. There was the Thuggis in 13th through the 19th centuries, and they would strangle their sacrificial victims and basically give their body parts or whatever to the goddess Kali. Okay, and this was a practice that again existed through the centuries, and the movement was destroyed by the British when they colonized India. But this is where the term thug comes from. So the modern Arab Islamist extremism. So various political phrases took place during the 20th century, and they were described in different ways. They had significant influence on activism among Arab nationalists and intellectuals. They included a few secular phrases, which included anti-colonial nationalist, pan-Arab nationalism, secular leftist radicalism. Some of those were somewhat influenced by Marxism. There's a few cases that we look at in the book. There's the cult case, the mysticism Rebellion in Uganda. Phase 1 in Uganda was the Holy Spirit Mobile Force, and that was led by Alice Auma Lakwena. And she believed that she was led, that she was sort of picked by God to help overthrow the Ugandan government. And she got thousands of followers to follow her and believe in her. And she gathered up this sort of army. And she convinced them if they covered themselves with like this holy oil, that their bodies would deflect any bullets from the army. And so they all went and met the army, and surprise, when the Ugandan army started firing on them, their bodies did not deflect bullets. So lots of people died. Of course, she fled Uganda and ended up in Kenya, and she stayed there till she died in 2007. After that, I guess nobody's for sure if he's her cousin or nephew, Joseph Kony, began the Lord's Resistance Army, and he's been extremely brutal in his method of resisting the Ugandan government and fighting against them. He's taken up creating like children's armies. He's been very notorious for that. Um, Doing mass rapings and pillagings and mass killings and things like this. It's been extremely brutal. Um, and they've had a very difficult time trying to resist and overcome his insurgencies. Religious scapegoating case. There's the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This was created in Tsarist Russia, um, and some professor there sort of disseminated this. And so this was back in around 1895 under Tsar Nicholas II. And basically, it's this concept that there's this vast um, conspiracy of Jews to take over the world, and it's really quite terrible. So it's even though it's a complete fabrication and completely false, it's been used by right wingists and neo Nazis and different people like this to try and claim that, or try to use as some sort of evidentiary piece of uh, a pamphlet of some kind, that it's proof that Jews are trying to take over the world. And it still pops up on alt right and neo Nazi type websites and such. And even though, like I said, that it has been debunked, they say that it's not really been debunked, that that's just what the you know the Jews want you to believe or whatever. It's really quite awful. Um, but that's just an example of religious scapegoating. Um, so understanding jihad as a primary religious motive, an observation and a caveat. So the observation, the instances of religious terrorism is disproportionately committed by radical Islamicists. But the caveat is the degree of misunderstanding in the West about the historical and cultural origins of the growth of radical interpretations of Islam. So, one of the things that your book talks about is that the word jihad is vastly misunderstood. And let me think, where is that? On page 141 in the chapter perspective 7.3. Please have a look at that because they talk about what jihad really means. In short, it means the word struggle, and it could be just about your struggle with, say, your homework or with some of your courses or something like this, or a struggle to quit smoking or something like this. It doesn't necessarily mean anything bad, but it can mean holy war, all the way up to something like that, but it doesn't necessarily mean those types of things. But 7.3 talks about it in more detail. But again, this caveat that so the caveat is that it's this like I said, this belief that jihad means holy war, and so therefore it's this thing that's intrinsically entwined with Islam, and that's just simply not really the case. And your book will talk about that some more, like I said, in 7.3. And the other is that jihad in this method is widely supported by all Muslims. And again, that's just simply not true. Again, Islam is a religion that's made up of, 1.4 or something billion people. And to presume that all of them support terrorism like this is absolutely preposterous, and the literature and the empirical evidence shows that that's just simply not the case. Just one second. So Anyway, then of course there's um, the practice of state-sponsored religious terrorism. Your book talks about Iran, and it'll talk about the case of their support for Hezbollah and the Palestinians for with Hamas, and so you can take a look at that. Um, However, there's some debate about the extent to which they are number one versus perhaps somebody like, say, Saudi Arabia now. But that's neither here nor there. We can just talk about Iran just for the sake of your book and for the text. Um, but the regional case of Pakistan and India, that's on page 143. So have a look at that as well. Dissident religious terrorism in the modern era. That's political violence conducted by groups of fervent religious true believers with faith in the sacred righteousness of their cause. And that they give the cases of the Grand Mosque incident, which was in November 1979, and they talk about the case of the Hebron Mosque massacre, which was in February of 1994. All of these are on page 145, but just for the interest of time, I want to focus on the Rabin assassination. That was in November of 1995. This one was particularly difficult because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one that is sort of the center of so much conflict in the region. Like, again, if you go back and you think about Iran supporting the Palestinian cause, and supporting Hamas, you'll see, other countries in the region also, even if they don't necessarily support Hamas, they cite the Palestinian conflict as being one of the main stickers and one of the main problems in the region. So it was particularly important when Yasser Arafat, who was the head of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was considered, as we talked about previously, a terrorist organization up until about this time, and he was elected the first president of Palestine, and Yasser Arafat, not Yasser Arafat, and Yitzhak Rabin, who was at the time the prime minister of Israel, and they get together with then President Clinton at Camp David to sign these peace accords, and it looked like they were really moving towards an actual two-state solution for the first time ever in history, and it was really tangible. You could almost touch it. You could see it. And it was really a historic moment. And it was so painful because this guy, Yigal Amir, kills Yitzhak Rabin. Okay, and he was a radical Jew, right? So he believed that what he was doing was right and was within Jewish law under the concept known as halacha, which to him was basically furthering, the rights of Jews, that this is their land, that, it was given to them by God, and that nobody has the right to, give it away. And he felt that that's what Yitzhak Rabin was doing. And so he was not going to sit back and let that happen. So again, this is an instance of religious terrorism where this man thought that Yitzhak Rabin was doing something wrong under religious law, and that he was some savior, again under religious law, and that he was doing God's will. Okay. And of course, since then, we have never seen anything as close to a two-state solution since. So that's why I wanted to kind of focus on this case again, because the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been such a sort of centerpiece for so many problems within the Middle East. And that was the closest we ever came. And so it was very tragic that this particular situation had happened. So more cases. There's the sectarian civil war in Iraq. That's where, because one of the problems that people talk about with the war in Iraq, when the United States got involved, was when that, yes, Saddam Hussein was a horrible person, but he kept the religious tensions between the Shia and the Sunni down, right? But then when he was gone, it sort of ripped all that off. And so the sectarian violence started to spring up between the between the minority Sunni and the majority Shia, right? So previously, the minority the minority Sunni were the ones who ran the country, okay? And so when the fall of Saddam Hussein happened, the majority Shia took over, and they sort of started to reign the country with this sort of iron fist, and were getting back at the Shia very brutally. And they also kind of weren't including the Kurds in any of this as well. And so, and so they, so the Sunni felt very slighted by all of this. And what ended up happening was, just like Barack Obama had sort of warned them, that if you don't include the Sunni, even though you feel slighted by them, right, you still have to include them in the equation. Yes, you felt slighted by them, but what you should do is just exclude the Baathists, who were Saddam Hussein's particular group, right? Don't include the Baathists, but let other, Sunni be involved in the picture, right? Just keep the Baathists out, but include other Sunni, because if you keep oppressing them, it's going to come back to haunt you. And that's what happened. Al-Baghdadi was a member of the Sunni sect, and they sort of rose up and start a new sort of terrorist group as a result of the sort of relative deprivation that was occurring from the state ignoring the will of the people and their poor treatment, etc. Also, splintering away from Al Qaeda that had occurred. Some of these people had splintered away from Al Qaeda and formed into ISIS. So there's a combination of things that were going on at the time. Many of the disaffected people who were angry at what was happening, who were being repressed down from the state, who weren't being treated properly, who felt that the state was oppressing them, decided to join up with ISIS. and certain people who had broken away from Al Qaeda joined ISIS as well. And all of this was a result of the sectarian violence that was occurring in Iraq. You can look at the movement case of the International Mujahideen, which is on page 146. That was the rebel groups in Afghanistan. And then the next one is Al Qaeda's Religious Foundation, and that is on page 147 to 148. Okay, so dissidents again in the modern era, the insurgency case, the rise of the Islamic State. So they, that's on page, let's see, 149. And so what was interesting about this particular case is that they started to, once they started to form, they formed really quickly. And they started seizing territory. And it happened really fast. Like, people were really shocked at how quickly they started taking over territory in Syria and Iraq. And so fast, like President Obama and people in the region didn't really know how to react, if they should react. They thought maybe, locally that the Iraqis or the Syrians might be able to take care of it, and that might be a better solution rather than have us intervene. But what ended up happening is that you had people who joined the fray, like some of the Chechens who came, who were like war veterans of two Chechen wars, like this guy here, Mohammed Shishani, who knew how to fight. And so they were seasoned war veterans, and they trained other soldiers. And so they were able to be highly effective in a short amount of time. And they were very effective also at recruiting, and did a really good, or maybe I should say really effective job, I guess, of seizing and holding on to territory, mainly by sort of cannibalizing bureaucracy on the ground, right? By basically saying, okay, we're in control here now, and so basically what we're going to have you do is you're going to do the job you've always done, but now we're just in charge, right? So whether if it's taking taxes, collecting taxes, or running the water department, or whatever it is, right? So they just basically had people do the job that they always did, but they were in charge, right? So that was one interesting feature that helped them stay in control as long as they did and as effectively as they did, was maintaining bureaucracy on the ground. So they were let's see, but they also were very brutal, right? So if people were trying to resist in any way, they would round up people and bring them out into the streets and do public beheadings and beatings and things like this. And so that was also effective in letting people know that they were in charge and that they would brook no dissent against them in any way. They would put people's heads on pikes along the street and let them sit there and rot like that kind of thing. These sort of very medieval type tactics, but they were very effective in instilling fear and terror within the populace to keep them under control. women were not allowed to go out into the street without coverings and this kind of thing. So that's how they were able to sort of consolidate their power and maintain control over populations. There's a national case of Boko Haram. Your book talks about that on page 150. Loosely translated, it means Western education is forbidden. And then there's the cult case of Shinrikyo, okay, and this was in Japan, and that's on page 150. And he got this sort of cult following that was this sort of combination of Christianity and Buddhism, strange combination. And they released gas into the Japanese subway and killed a bunch of people. And you can look more at that case on page 150. So, trends and projections. Religion is a central feature of the new terrorism. Previously, it was more focused on more secular type pursuits. Extremist religious propaganda cannot be prevented. You can't really stop it from happening. Okay, most people follow religions, and you can't tell people they can't be religious, right? So there's nothing you can really do about that because trying to you can't keep people from a faith. So that would be really the only way you could do that. And that's just going to be impossible. A new generation of Islamist extremists have been primed. So the main thing you can do is just try to watch out for that and try to monitor that and try to get people within the community to try and tip off law enforcement when they see people who they might be concerned about. Al-Qaeda has become more than an organization. It evolved to become a symbol and an ideology. So, you know, even there was talk for a long time that even though Osama bin Laden was caught and murdered, and that was important just for a sense of justice for the sake of America. I mean, he plotted and masterminded the attack on the World Trade Center as well as the Pentagon and all of that, and the deaths of thousands of Americans. But that ultimately we understood that at the same time that his death was more of a symbolic thing, and we also understood that that cutting off the head, that another one would grow, and that it was bigger than him. That it's an ideology. So, and you can't really kill an ideology, right? So, for example, now one of his sons has taken over Al Qaeda, right? And so people are still flocking to the organization, they're flocking to what it represents. And so, even if we were to say capture and kill Osama bin Laden's son, maybe one of his sons or one of his brothers or somebody else will take over. So either the ideology has to fizzle out and lose its luster, or something else will have to take its place in some other way. The jihadist movement has become a globalized phenomenon. It's seen as this sort of globalized movement where they encourage people wherever you are, you can be one person and you can enact jihad, global war, holy war, and do it in your local hometown, right? And so that way it becomes more diffuse and more difficult to fight. Christian extremists continue to promote religious motivation for the war on terror. So they continue to talk about that this is some, you know, war of East against West, of you know, Christians against infidels, and all of these sorts of things, and that just sort of adds fuel to the fire. So again, for this chapter, you can go ahead and look at the e-flashcards on the website. There's quizzes you can do as well to help you prepare for the quiz and ultimately for the final. And there's other resources that you can take a look at. And if you have any other questions, please let me know. Thanks.